Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, friends of MICAS, distinguished guests. It is my pleasure to be with you here today for this talk, today on a Saturday morning. And we are live on Facebook. We have people watching us as well from home and from their mobile phones. And it is my pleasure to be here with you this morning for two specific reasons. My name is Keen, first of all, and this is my third time hosting an event at MICAS on a Saturday morning. It is my third time, so that makes it special already. But the two reasons why I'm honored to be here is because this is the first time I'm hosting this type of an event from within MICAS itself. So it is a pleasure to be in this magnificent venue that we have this morning here. But second of all, the second reason why I'm very happy to be here is because today marks exactly 1 year since MICAS was officially opened. 1 year already, and we are going to mark the first year as we started marking it yesterday with this magnificent exhibition of Milton Avery that we had the pleasure to make official yesterday, and I'm sure also yourselves had the pleasure of going around the MICAS museum, the exhibition, and could really enjoy everything that's been set up there. And today we'll go into further detail. In fact, the first talk that we have this morning is by MICAS Artistic Director, Edith Devaney, who also happens to be the curator of this exhibition. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Edith Devaney on stage.
Thank you very much. In thinking about this talk and what I wanted to cover, I was struck once again at the complexity at looking at Avery both as an artist and in considering his place within the canon of modern American art. For while the accessibility of his work and its non-dependence and academic interpretation are hallmarks of Avery's style, the development of his art and the place he occupies in overall modern art are more challenging to unravel. As with his work, what looks and is indeed harmonious on the surface belies a much greater complexity at its core. Each work is a careful distillation of a lifetime of observation and understanding, coupled with a formidable drive and work ethic. And it is this quality, amongst many others, which makes his work of such interest to artists, both during his lifetime and, as this exhibition illustrates, long after. This talk will focus on the premise of this exhibition and consider the whole notion of influence in art, a subject I've already covered in my catalogue, in the essay in the catalogue. And I'll also make some passing reference to Avery's development and his position in the trajectory of American modernism, as well as his legacy. So this is a quote from the artist Hans Hofmann in 1952. He was a revered artist teacher, a German émigré, and he said of Milton Avery, "Avery was one of the first to understand colour as a creative means. He was one of the first to relate colours in a plastic way." At the time Hans Hofmann said this, abstract expressionism in America had reached its zenith, with the protégés of Avery, Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, and Adolf Gottlieb, all being pivotal figures within the colour field section of this movement. I have written in the past about the extent to which Avery's influence through these younger painters had a major impact on how elements of that particular movement unfolded. And this exhibition, which we staged here at MICAS, makes the argument that Avery's work continues to exert an influence through these artists, through these artists who follow in their wake. This is a self-portrait, which is actually not in this show, but I just wanted to see it again and for you all to see it. And I wanted to look more closely at the whole notion of influence and for example, this self-portrait reminds me very much of Pierre Bonnard Interiors, where the figure is in one space, and an open door reveals the space behind, which is recreated in detail. And one of the interesting things about Avery's portraiture was that he was a very accomplished portrait painter, and in his younger years he did a lot of portraits. But by the time he got to the late 30s, he stopped, and the only portraits he continued to paint were of himself. So he charted his aging process and development throughout all his styles until his death. But of course, the figure remained fundamental to his practice. But just to make that comparison between Avery's work and Pierre Bonnard's Nude in an Interior from 1935 in the Phillips collection, not only is Avery passing on influence through his work, he's also accumulating his own references from works in the past. And I move on now to one of the works featured in the exhibition by one of the contemporary artists, Andrew Cranston. And he executed this work specifically for the exhibition in direct response to the Milton Avery checklist. And he's following the same trajectory, this connection through Bonnard and Vuillard. And he, very much like Avery, across a stretch of several decades, seems to be making the same passing references to the same artist, but obviously in a different way through a slightly different filter. But briefly, I just wanted to explain my own route to Avery and how I became so intensely interested in his work, which in time led me to the instigation of this exhibition, because in some part, it is informative of his past and ongoing status. Anyone who has the merest knowledge of American art is familiar with Milton Avery's work, and I had long been aware of him, but had seen very few examples of his oeuvre firsthand in Europe. And as was noted in the speeches last night, this is only his second museum exhibition in Europe, which is very hard to believe. In 2016, I was still working at the Royal Academy of Arts, and I curated a large abstract expressionism exhibition, which also traveled to the Guggenheim in Bilbao. And in so much of the research that I was doing in America for that exhibition, Avery's name just kept coming up all the time and was cited as a key protagonist of that movement. And I became increasingly interested in exploring that whole concept of his influence a little bit more. And then I did the first Avery show in Europe, again at the Academy, but also touring in America in 2021-22. And one of the most amazing kind of responses to that was from contemporary artists. And it was very much the enthusiasm that came from them that I became very conscious that they were all citing him as a major inspiration for his unique approach to color and his compositions. And these conversations with artists were a complete revelation, actually, about their perspective on Avery. As the late art historian Dory Ashton so accurately noted, Avery is a painter's painter, and indeed his art was, and continues to be, held in the highest regard by other painters, which of course is a thesis of this exhibition. But this particular work, Woman Ironing, was a turning point for me. It was in 2014, I came across this work in the Cantor collection at Stanford University, and I was there to try and secure work by Richard Diebenkorn for a forthcoming exhibition I was working on. And in a gallery full of very big, quite macho American paintings from the 20th century, this was the one that spoke to me. It was just like this little jewel, because it's quite a small work, and it just stood out. And it's a very typical painting of Avery for this time. The very ordinary subject matter of a woman going about her domestic chores, but it's treated in the most effective way by his use of color. My first thought was Félix Vallotton, the French painter, the Belgian painter, and Edgar Degas for the effective use of the dynamic diagonal. And it's such a compelling composition. The contrast between the dark floor, the light blue walls, intimations of a doorway scratched into the surface of the thin blue paint. And actually, this scratching into the surface of paint was a process that March Avery, Avery's daughter, who's also included in our show with 3 beautiful works, she mentioned it in her interview for the exhibition catalogue as one of the innovations within his work. And what's remarkable is the relationship between the figure of the woman and the ironing board, with both described in complementary colours ranging from pink through orange hues to reds, unifying the figure and the object in absolute harmony. And this was executed in 2045, which was the point where Avery really made his breakthrough in colour, the recognition of which was the focus of Hans Hofmann's earlier comment that I read. And just to give you an impression of what he might have been looking at, this is Felix Vallotton, Box Seats at the Theatre from 1909. Of the contemporary artists, I start with Gary Hume, as he was the first to converse with me about his deep admiration for Milton Avery. He first saw Milton Avery's work at the Waddington Galleries in London. Leslie Waddington sold Avery's work, I think, from the 70s. So that was an opportunity for artists to get to see it. And this was amongst one of the first works that I selected, if not the first work from contemporary artists. And immediately I saw it, I was struck by the potential dialogue between that and this wonderful Milton Avery, Sails in Sunset, which is in our exhibition. And I think, one of the things that we've really tried to address in the layout of the show and the design of the show is opening up these dialogues between the contemporary work and Avery's work. This is a very early photograph from 1920 of Avery sketching or painting in Gloucester. And Avery's route towards being established in the art world was unconventional and really quite lengthy. He was born in 1885 into a working-class family, which settled near Hartford in Connecticut. His father supported the family by working as a tanner. And Avery left school very young, at the age of 16, when his father died. And in 1905, he enrolled in a course of commercial lettering at the Connecticut League of Art Students. And after a short time, he transferred to an art course, which he pursued this teaching, this training for the next 15 years, which was part-time. But he was very, very serious in his endeavor. And it set him for a lifetime in the arts. American Impressionism dominated Avery's training, and the depiction of the natural world seen in the American Impressionists such as John Henry Twatchman here held much appeal to him, particularly their focus on the landscape and a painting directly from the motif. This is Ernest Lawton, another influence on Avery. And you can see from Avery's early work, this is a piece from 1918, that he's really imitating elements of Lawton's technique. And he used a palette knife to apply the paint, blending it onto the canvas with a finger to create a smooth surface on each of the impasto paint marks. And each enamel-like smooth mark contributed to that sense of variegated light across the uneven refractive surface of the painting, working in concert with the color. And I think this is so interesting because I think one of the things that you see in the later paintings in the exhibition is how he is still able, with much, much thinner paint and in a much looser way, to really get that sense of light and evoke the light that's reflected from the sea in particular. This is a painting of New York City in 2028, and Avery arrived in the 1920s. And his arrival in New York coincided with the beginning of what was to be one of the most creative periods of regeneration in American cultural history, starting in 1929 with the opening of MoMA under the direction of the visionary Alfred Barr and the Whitney Museum of American Art 3 years later. And by the 1930s, so many influential artists and intellectuals who were fleeing the rise of Nazism in Europe had settled in New York as well. And as he had done in the countryside, in New York, Avery turned his gaze towards his surroundings. Although compositionally interesting and reflecting some of the design elements that had appeared in his recent landscapes, New York clearly was not and never would be an enduring subject for him. And City, this work here, is a very good example of his urban compositions, conveying the compression and gloom of the city on the brink of the Great Depression. And in this work, you can see he's already beginning to distort form and perspective and is applying paint more thinly and without texture. This is a portrait, a self-portrait by Mark Rothko, dating from 1936, and one of his classic works from 1957. And Avery met Mark Rothko in 1928 at the Opportunity Gallery, where they were both exhibiting. And they were to remain lifelong friends, despite being of different generations. And Rothko soon introduced him to Avery, to Barnett Newman, and to Adolf Gottlieb. And particularly Adolf Gottlieb, along with Rothko, remained very, very engaged friends with Avery. And I'll just show you, this is Mark Rothko's work from 1938. So by this stage, he'd known Avery for 10 years, very influenced by his work. And he's picking up on Avery's urban dark depictions of everyday life. So he's really looking at the same subject matter and looking at the kind of, the oppression of the city. But I want to just talk a little bit about Avery picking up influences as well. And one of the things he gravitated towards when he was in the city was events and gatherings which showed people enjoying themselves and activities which took them away from the everyday life experience. And this was the biggest canvas that he painted until he started doing the very late works, which you see in the exhibition here. And it's a great example, executed with such bravado and easy humour, which Avery was able to inject into his painting so deftly. We know that Avery was a regular visitor of museums and galleries, and he and Sally devoted each Saturday, his wife Sally, also an artist, each Saturday to museum visits. And one of the things I really enjoyed doing when I was preparing for the first Avery exhibition I did was to trace some of the exhibitions and the contents of the exhibitions that he would have seen in New York, because I'm pretty convinced from things that I pick up from Sean, his Avery's grandson, and from March, his daughter, that Avery was kind of assiduous in going to absolutely everything that was on show in New York. So I'm sure that he must have seen this work by Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. The subject is the same, of the circus, the same sense of frenzy, of whirling activity, and the strange and sometimes distorted composition. It really does bear a resemblance to Avery's painting. And given both the dates of the MoMA exhibition and Avery's enthusiasm for seeing absolutely everything, particularly European modernism, I think he has to have been influenced by this work, whether consciously or subconsciously. This wonderful Yellow Christ, which Sean tells me is probably the first time it's ever been shown in a museum show ever, so we're very lucky to have it here, is such a singular work in the exhibition, and one that actually really took the attention of so many of the contemporary artists involved with the exhibition. And of course, it references Paul Gauguin's Yellow Christ as well from 1889. Again, I mean, this is a work called The Desert from 1939. It's in MoMA. I showed it in London in our exhibition. And it includes David's friend, Avery's friend David Berlik, the Russian poet, artist, and intellectual associated with Russian futurism. So Avery was, although he was a very quiet person, he became very engaged in cultural life and knew a lot of artists and intellectuals working in New York at the time. But again, I think there's an interesting comparison to this work by Egon Schiele, The Friends, the larger version of it. And then back to how he influences others. This is Woman in Blue from 1935. And this is a work by Adolf Gottlieb entitled The Leopard Coat. This is Milton Avery and his wife, Sally, in 1945, sketching. And it illustrates this lifelong pattern of them taking months off in the summer to go to a place of beauty and to draw and sketch on paper. And having exhausted the subject matter of the city, Avery started to make paintings from all of these drawings from his watercolors, which were done in situ. And what he was able to then translate later in the studio onto canvas was the moment and the feeling of a place. And we have in the exhibition a display of some of his finest watercolors, which I urge you to see. They're absolutely beautiful. This is in the exhibition, one of his still life paintings. It's Still Life with Skull from 1946. I think it's a really remarkable work. There's so many references here. There's references to Matisse, there's references to so many artists. And then when you look at this work by Barnett Newman, I can't help feeling that there has to be some connection here. Not just the palette, but just going back to the Avery painting, if you were to remove on the left-hand side the doorknob and the cockerel, it almost looks like one of Barnett Newman's classic zips. And you've got the corresponding line, the thicker line on the other side. Another self-portrait by Milton Avery, which is Avery on 57th Street. His great portrait, very amusing. In 1944, Avery's career took a significant step forward. The previous year, he'd signed up to the prestigious gallery of Paul Rosenberg and Company, which was founded in France, but recently had opened in New York. And it represented many French modernist painters, including Matisse, Picasso, and Braque. So it really gave Avery such an opportunity to see these works firsthand. And Avery also, that same year, had his first one-man museum exhibition show at the Phillips Memorial Art Gallery in Washington, D.C. But this self-portrait just shows his confidence. I mean, this is and he's annotated the names of his galleries, because it wasn't just one gallery that represented him at this time. It was a few. And he'd gone from really being unknown to reaching everyone's attention. So it was such an important moment for him. And it was at this point that all of his former and consistent development culminated in a series of compositions that really was to change the course of his career. An example of this is Two Figures at a Desk from 1944. His keen interest in colour, already evident from the 1930s, evolved still further, and he began to lighten, flatten, and layer his pigments onto the canvas, creating a luminosity across closely related planes of tone, with each colour modulated to complement the adjacent hue rather than to provide contrast. This, along with a simultaneous simplification of form, replaced traditional perspective in his work with a much more subtle intimation of depth and atmosphere, both of which he evoked with colour. As first seen in the 1944 paintings and exemplified at this work, Two Figures at a Desk. And it's interesting to compare the composition, to this work by Henri Matisse, the piano lesson from 1932. It's the same restrained description of the figures, the same side view, the same isolation. Obviously, it's much more decorative in form, but there's definitely a kind of interesting compositional similarity. Avery's daughter March, who I said before is in the show, represented by three beautiful paintings, was the subject of many of Avery's works. As I said earlier, he stopped formal portraiture in the late 1930s, but the figure was so important to him as a form and a vehicle for colour. And March was a willing subject, and she's got very recognisable features, a very lovely triangular face, long limbs. And there's a beautiful portrait that he did for her called March in Babushka from 1944. And you can see the pared down features, it's so reduced in form, which again is very, very reminiscent of Matisse's work. But I wanted to just make a comparison to Barclay Hendricks, who painted this work, Sir Nelson Solid, in 1970, the late Barclay Hendricks. He was exposed to Avery's work at the Wadsworth Athenaeum during his time at Yale, and elements of Avery's mature style found expression in this work. And here, the block of background colour and body create two zones of colour, bringing greater focus to the face and its hat and scarf, which is very similar to March's headgear. This work is from the Metropolitan Art Museum. And I mean, again, when you think about Rothko's paintings, you've got these bands of colour going across. This was done in 1945. But one of the things that Avery was so good at was this ability to place the figure in the landscape and treating both of the genres in the same way and somehow fusing them together. And he makes it look very easy. It's a very it feels like it's quite a simple composition. But my argument is actually it's quite a complex thing to pull off. And one of the artists that has copied this in some way is Peter Doig, and I think there's such a similarity between these works. This is Night Bathers of 2019. He's doing exactly the same thing here, and like Avery, he's using non-associative colours and placing the figure in nature. So you have, just going back to Avery's work, with the very pale figures in the foreground and the very highly coloured swimmer. And then Peter Doig's blue sunbather. So this is a beautiful picture of March called March in Brown, and it's one of Avery's very finest works, and we're so honoured to have it here in our exhibition. And it also proved to be one of the works that was so stimulating to the contemporary artists. I mean, just to let you know how we formulated this show, we put together a survey of Milton Avery's work, which we knew we were never going to show in a chronological form, but we sent this list to all of the artists to get their response. And some of them were compelled to paint new work, and others to go back and look at work that they'd already done and make selections from there. But this was one that stimulated so much interest from so many of them. It was painted 2 years after the quote I read out by Hans Hofmann. And Hofmann, who had witnessed the evolution of Avery's colour over the previous 2 decades, would have noted that by the 1940s, his art had changed significantly, particularly in this deployment of colour. So he creates this wonderful luminosity through the closely related planes. And this treatment, along with the simplification of form, replaced traditional Western perspective in his work with a more subtle intimation. And as Avery himself stated in an interview in 1952, for him, the design of the overall canvas was important, but not so important as the design in depth, the function of one colour with another. And this is what really established him as a leading American colourist, a position that has never been contested to this day. And just speaking of the influence of this work and how it really spoke to our contemporary artists, this beautiful work by Nicolas Party, done in pastel, just has got such a kind of interesting connection with Avery's portrait of March. And Henni Alftan, who painted this work for the exhibition in response to the Avery checklist. Again, she's using the body as this vehicle for colour, and creating these very, very different planes and shapes. So A Hint of Autumn was another inspirational work within the exhibition, which many of the artists gravitated towards. And March Avery, we've got this work called Autumn Ginkgo, and I think there's just such a lovely connection between her father's work and her work. But what's interesting about Avery's work here is, again, it's thinking back to Mark Rothko and what he was doing at the time. I mean, by this stage, he was well into his career with those works that we know with the floating triangles of color. And that's evoked here in the horizon, in the line between the ground and the background. But you've also got that very reduced form of the tree with that straight line going down, which is really reminiscent of Barnett Newman's Zip paintings, which I referred to earlier, and also Clifford Still's Lifelines, which had that kind of zigzag effect through his work. And March's work is a little bit more decorative, but it's got such a kind of strong connection. And Nicolas Party, Harold Ancart, painted this in response to that work. And they're hung together with the same line going across them, dividing the ground and the background. But there's a kind of electric light feeling to this. It really pulsates. And what we aim to achieve in the exhibition, and I hope that you all agree that we got there, was to almost give a different reading of both works and to bring it, if it needed it, which it doesn't, but bring a kind of different energy to Milton Avery's paintings and a sense of history to the contemporary works. Just looking at other things that Avery was influenced by, this was an intriguing work that that is not in the show. It's called Beach Blankets, and like so many of his late works, if there wasn't a title, you would just assume it's an abstract work. Non-associated, well, it's very, very odd colours, really beautifully painted. Those wonderful thin down paints, those glazes that he manages to achieve, which was something that Rothko picked up on. And used to great effect in his more mature works. But thinking again about some of the works that Avery would have seen in New York at the time, I always felt that there was something here in the Edvard Munch work, which is Two Women on a Shore from 1898, a woodblock print. But that similar sense of kind of isolation, these very strange shapes, these odd colours. So Boathouse by the Sea, again, like March and Brown, it is really one of Milton Avery's signature pieces. Absolutely beautiful work from late in his career. And he was painting this in Cape Cod, towards the end of his life, when his health wasn't so good, and he was holidaying with, I'd call it, it's not holiday because they were working, with Mark Rothko and Gottlieb, and they were all painting together. And you can see his work getting bigger. His canvases are getting bigger. He's going to bigger size than he ever used before, apart from the chariots that I showed you. But he's also abstracting so much, but they're not abstract paintings. This is Boathouse by the Sea. It's not an abstract. He's taking away, he's subtracting detail. And again, it had enormous appeal when we were talking to our contemporary artists. And one of the very interesting comparisons was the one that Jonas Wood made, because he got terribly excited by Boathouse by the Sea and came up with the idea of this wonderful work called French Open 7 from 2015. And I think it's just a kind of, it's an inspired choice, and they're hung together in the exhibition, and it makes you look at both works very, very differently. You're looking at the kind of color blocking in Jonas's work. You're looking for more abstraction, and the opposite is true for Avery. So I think that's a really interesting dialogue. And this is just to prove the point that Mark Rothko was still picking up an elements of Avery's work into his mature work. I think this is a very interesting use of colours, very similar to Avery's colours. We know that Avery's work spanned and to some extent became the link between two significant movements in the United States in the 20th century, American Impressionism and Abstract Expressionism, with both having an impact on his oeuvre. And through his close association with key members of the Abstract Expressionist movement, which I've mentioned already, Rothko, Gottlieb, and Newman, Avery's work played an influential role in how that American artistic movement developed and unfolded. And what is clear is that Avery was and continues to be a bridge between many artistic tendencies. As suggested earlier, he effectively bridged the gap between American Impressionism and Abstract Expressionism, taking lessons from one and passing on experiences to the other. But he was also a bridge between European modernism and American painting, when so many of his generation had turned their backs on it. They were looking to develop an all-American painting. Avery just wanted to do his own thing. He was looking in other directions. And as this exhibition illustrates, Avery to this day remains a bridge between American and European modern representational painting and contemporary artists striving to celebrate today's world. And I end with a quote by Mark Rothko from his eulogy to Milton Avery in 1965. There have been others in our generation who have celebrated the world around them, but none with that inevitability where the poetry penetrated every pore of the canvas to the very last touch of the brush. Thank you.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, friends of MICAS. Thank you once again for joining us back here. We have the last part of this morning's session here at MICAS, and the last part will be a conversation, a panel discussion that will be happening right here on stage. As you can see, everyone is ready for that to start, and at the end of it we will have some time for some questions and answers. So the time you will see me back on stage is the time when you can ask questions to one of the panelists, and they will be able to answer your questions as well. So during the discussion, please feel free to take notes and reserve your questions for that stage. But to introduce to us our three panelists, please join me in welcoming our moderator, MICAS International Committee member, Mr. Timothy Rabb.
Thank you, and good morning. The end is in sight. This is the last session. We could go look at the exhibition afterwards. And I'm delighted to be here again, and I'm delighted to be in this space. One of the things that I look forward to every time I've returned to Malta is the progress that the staff here have made on building out this facility. They're not done yet, but each and every year seems to represent a major step forward. So congratulations to Phyllis and her staff and everyone involved in putting this complex together. There's still work to be done, but the progress that has been made is really quite extraordinary. So they deserve a round of applause for that. I'm going to offer a few remarks to begin with, and then a little bit later on in the session. In part because I'm certainly not an expert in the work of Milton Avery, and there are others on this panel and perhaps in this room who can speak more effectively to that. My claim to any connection with Avery is that I was the director of several museums in the United States, finishing with the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And at each and every institution, I was the steward of a number of works by Avery, works on paper, paintings especially, and had the great pleasure of showing his work in the context of American art, and also in the context of, from time to time, of European art at each of those institutions. And obviously that set me to think about many of the issues that Edith covered in her lecture and we'll also cover in this panel discussion. But before we get to that, let me introduce the panel members just briefly. From the other end, we have Edith, who really requires no introduction. She's the curator of the exhibition. She gave the lecture this morning. She's done remarkable work in examining and presenting Avery's work to the public. So welcome again, Edith, and thank you for participating. Next to her is Sean Cavanaugh, who should take pride of place in terms of patrimony, being both the son of one of the artists in the exhibition, March Avery, and also Milton Avery's grandson. So he brings obviously a unique perspective to this conversation. I look forward to hearing what he has to say. And then bravely, Henni Alftan, one of the artists in the exhibition and standing in for the rest, has agreed to participate, and I thank you for that. So as I thought about this panel, first of all, I hope that we can bring some new perspectives to light on the issues that Edith covered in her lecture and perhaps add some dimension to them. But I also wanted to keep it focused on what I concluded were two of the key issues that this exhibition raised, and hopefully we can get some way towards addressing them. So I also would like to set aside some time for the audience to ask some questions. So we'll get to that towards the end of the session. So with these housekeeping notes out of the way, let me begin by suggesting that our discussion focus on two fairly broad topics as they pertain to Avery's work and the work of the 7 other artists in this exhibition. The first topic is to try to understand the enduring appeal of Avery's work, particularly to contemporary painters, which is obviously one of the key assumptions underlying the present exhibition. Now, to be sure, this is an obvious point, but nonetheless, it still begs the question, what is it that makes Avery's work of such interest now, some 6 decades after his death? And in this regard, I can think of many contemporaries of his whose stars rose higher and who were considered more influential in their lifetimes, but few whose appeal have remained as potent and as widespread as Avery's. And I think that's an interesting question. So with that in mind, what we might ask are what are the salient characteristics of his work that are responsible for this enduring appeal? First that comes to mind is his ability as a colorist, which always seems to have both a sense of surprise and of rightness to it. For example, Hoffman's claim, quoted by Edith, that Avery was one of the first artists to relate colors in a plastic way. Curiously, as I look at Avery's work, the more I think of him not only as a colorist, but as a tonal painter, especially during the 30s and 40s, rather than again, simply as a gifted colorist. And perhaps we should talk about those two issues in relation to each other. Or is the appeal, to some extent, about his draftsmanship, which also has a kind of uncanny sense of rightness to it in terms of describing the things that he renders in a sort of weird but miraculous shorthand, and is, in my view, completely undervalued in most critical discussions of his work. Again, we think of Avery mostly as a colorist, but for much of his career, in some ways it was drawing that really animated his paintings in a really wonderful way. Or is it his palpable sense of place? Gloucester, Massachusetts, the Vermont countryside, the Gaspé Peninsula, or his own apartment? That is a consistent element of all of his paintings. Yet it's not only his sense of place that we feel so keenly when looking at Avery's work, but also their familiarity. Things Avery knew intimately as part of his everyday life and to which we respond in kind. Mark Rothko characterized the subjects of Avery's paintings, and here I quote, as a domestic, unheroic cast, end quote. And I think that is what Henni Alftan is getting at when she speaks in the catalog about feeling the quotidian in Avery's art. If Avery's choice of subjects, though, remains familiar and to some extent predictable, his approach to rendering those subjects varied almost infinitely. Indeed, it's remarkable how much he varied the ways in which he rendered different subjects, landscapes and seascapes, to be sure, but also the figure. And much of this had to do with how he exaggerated, distorted, or cropped forms, which is perhaps most evident in his figural works, but is also evident in his treatment of other subjects. So in this regard, I cannot help but think of how important Avery is Avery's example is to the contemporary artists in the exhibition. And finally, in terms of defining Avery's appeal to posterity, I suspect that the most important aspect of his work is how he fluently integrated the ostensibly unbridgeable realms of abstraction and representation, relentlessly flattening and simplifying the image to a point at which it is as much about the constituent elements of painting, color, shape, line, and composition, as it is about the subject he has chosen, landscape, figure, or still life. Avery himself put it this way, I quote, "I try to construct a picture in which shapes, spaces, colors form a set of unique relationships, independent of any subject matter. At the same time, I try to capture and translate the excitement and emotion aroused in me by the impact with the original idea." Quote, to which he might have added that there always seemed to be a kind of dynamic interplay between the two, his response to the subject on the one hand, and on the other, his impulse, which grew across his lifetime to really abstract these things, to distill them to their essence, and render them on the canvas. And I think that must be something that, again, constitutes what appeals to him, about him most to contemporary artists. So with these particular questions in mind, I'd sort of like to ask our panelists, perhaps starting with Edith, about how can we break down this idea of his appeal to contemporary artists, and what are the things that really matter most, in your opinion, to artists today about Avery's work?
Yeah, there's quite a lot to unpack there, but you know, the quote that you made about getting to the emotion of the work, that's completely key. That emotional element is absolutely embedded in his work, and I think that's what makes it very appealing for any visitor to the galleries to see and encounter. But it also makes it a very special relationship with another artist who's looking at his work in that way. I mean, aside from all of the amazing things he's doing in terms of color and playing with perspective and taking detail away. What was interesting for me, talking to all of the individual artists, because we started off, as I said in my talk, we started off with the Avery checklist, and then we approached each artist to have a very separate dialogue with that checklist and with us to talk about what they might send in. And more than one of them made the comment that they felt that they had discovered Avery themselves. It was a very, very personal relationship they had with him. And that's unusual. I can't think of many other artists where that would happen, of Avery's stature, but that feeling that there was some special bond between them and him. He spoke to them. And I think, you know, from a just encountering Avery's work at a kind of visceral level, there's a joyfulness to it. Every work, it always makes you feel better to see an Avery painting. And I think that, you know, that kind of develops an emotion and an impulse in all of us, but I think in particular for contemporary artists, to engage with that, to understand how he achieves that within his work. It's endlessly fascinating.
Thank you. Sean, you obviously hold a very privileged perspective with regard to this question, so I don't know whether you want to answer it personally, meaning, you know, this is...
yeah, it's definitely, it is very personal, and it's, walking through the show is like walking through a scrapbook of my family's history.
Yeah.
I would agree with Edith on the sort of humor and joy. My mother always says, you know, Milton took the craft very seriously, but at the end of the day, like, he was still having a lot of fun. Like, nothing was more fun than making the art, right? And you're trying hard to make a great painting, but you're not taking yourself too seriously while you're doing it. And I think it comes through. Also, there's no political side of it. It's very personal, and I think it comes through to people, I think. You know, and you were talking about the drafting. He was an amazing draftsman, and all his reductive choices are choices. They're not because of the lack of skill or anything like that. And you know, I don't know. I feel like everyone sees something different in the work, right? Some people are drawn to color, some people to forms, but there is a wide-ranging appeal that holds, you know, that doesn't go away.
So let me, given that you're a son and a grandson, and you are, all three of you.
And I'm trying to paint myself when I'm not on stage.
Are artists, right? So you're in a position to speak to the question of influence directly on your mother and then on you. And then how you thinking about that, your relationship with your mother and your grandfather, how that legacy is reflected into the world and understood by the world around you. You have to think about that, I assume, every day.
Yeah, it's a big shadow, you know? And I think it's much harder for my mother than it is for me. Just being, you know, I never was in the room with him while he was painting. But it definitely is something that I don't know if you battle against it, but you're trying to carve your own place. And it's you know, it's strange when, I mean, people introduce me sometimes, before they basically say my name, they say, "This is Milton Avery's grandson." And I'm like, "Hi, you know, I'm a painter too," you know. So it definitely can be weird and a little bit intimidating. Because, I don't know, my mother and I look at some of these paintings and we both say, like, we would never get there to that finish point. Like, you know, some of the color harmonies and things, I'm just like, I love it when it's there, but I don't know if I could see it myself, like, on a blank canvas.
So with that in mind, let me ask us to pause at this point, because I want to ask you a question about Avery's early career. You both have talked about that sense of joy and lightness and delight. When I look at Avery's work and think about his career, I also think that was those were hard-won things.
Sure.
And I think it would be interesting for this audience to hear about, briefly about how Avery became an artist over time. He's working for the longest time, going to school when he had a moment.
Yeah.
And continually, I guess in his spare time and in evenings, really studying and working to get to that point where he could launch himself as an artist. But I've rarely seen a career in American art where such perseverance was a key to understanding his work.
It helps to marry a woman who has deep beliefs in your skills, I think. You know, my grandmother really, you know, she was really the breadwinner for decades, and sort of said, "Okay, I'm putting my career on hold, and I've got the day job, and you stay at the easel." And I think she never wavered from that belief in his like abilities, and I think that was from from early when they first met in Gloucester. That helps, definitely. So yeah, he had time. I mean, my mother always said nobody had anything. We were, you know, those dark 30s pictures.
Yeah.
You know, 20s into 30s. There's a reason they're those tones, I think, a little bit, that is hard for us to really comprehend. But the ability to just keep making work, I don't think anything else really mattered very much. Like, you know, you have an apartment to live in, you have some food. They were like, we ate a lot of peanut butter, is what my grandmother told me. Like,
yet her support was unwavering, huh?
Yeah, exactly. And she was a terrible cook anyway, but but yeah, it didn't really, nothing else really mattered. I feel like they spent time with their friends, and they made work, and they made art, and they went to go see art, and it was really their religion, you know.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Let's pivot and ask Henni Alftan to speak about this question of appeal, both in terms of how you respond to Avery's work and what aspects of it engage you the most, but also if I could ask you to think more broadly about his appeal to contemporary artists today, because I'm sure you've given some thought to that.
Well, for me it's more pragmatic. Well, I'm a pragmatic person, but also because I'm a painter. Obviously, the colors and the self-audacity of the simplifications, but also because I think I aspire in my work to some things where he went. So I can really look up to him as a lodestar for that. There are the simplification, the radical simplification of the shapes is not just appealing. For me, it has a function. It allows the paint to exist as paint without any significant impasto and to be present. Mm-hmm. And also the other thing is the simplification for me has to do also with the quotidian subject matter in my work. That I'm asking, the less I show, the more I'm asking you to pay attention to whatever there is, the little that there is. And it's not because what I paint is important, the subject matter is not necessarily important, it's just for the sake of paying attention, of being, because painting is also a physical object that you're in front of, and it's a unique object. It's the wonder of, if you see a painting in an exhibition in America now, and 10 years later you see it, and you know it's the same old friend, you see. There's the emotional effect to it that is kind of very peculiar as a medium. And like if you can do it with the least amount of to get into some sort of an essence of things. I mean, Avery, from what I gather, is always painting the observed world. I mean, I do the same, but I don't. I do it out of how I remember it or how I would describe it, instead of how I don't sketch in front of what I see. But as I gathered, Avery also sketched and then went to the studio, and there was a part of a recollection of seeing, which is different because it's how it's less perfect in a way than what you would see in front of your eyes, but it's more essential what you retain from.
One of the things that I think is really interesting, and you kind of brought this up in your lecture, Edith, is the directionality of influence and of knowledge of work. And for the longest time, the common wisdom, whether it was true or not is another matter, was that influence flowed primarily, in terms of modernism, flowed primarily from Europe towards the United States. And we've seen in the last 2 decades, I think the UK particularly has been instrumental in presenting major exhibitions of American art, not simply of individual artists, but of movements and of different times. I remain amazed that that the UK, for example, did a number of major exhibitions on American 19th century landscape painting. But coming back to this exhibition and that question, could you trace for us a little bit how Avery has come to the attention of, particularly of European painters over the course of time, and how that's happened? Obviously, your show at the RA was instrumental in that, but it's the availability of these things and that really matters, and it's been very slow in coming that much of American art, particularly before mid-century, mid-20th century, has been seen by a lot of artists, unless they've come to the United States and made an effort to look at American collections. And even then, you might not find all that many Averys on view, right?
I don't know if I can answer that in any comprehensive way, because I'm slightly mystified by it. When I did the Abstract Expressionism exhibition at the Royal Academy in 2016, it was enormous. It was an enormous exhibition, and it was the first time in 45 years that abstract expressionism as a movement was examined in Europe, which is, you find it hard to believe that. The same with Richard Diebenkorn. I did a Richard Diebenkorn exhibition in 2014. That was the first time that he'd had a museum show in Europe. I think for individual artists, for someone like Avery, I think that one of the things that shaped him was, as I've described, he fell between two movements, American Impressionism and Abstract Expressionism, and was intrinsically linked to both for different reasons. But because he was a kind of outsider at that time, and he purposefully didn't want to throw in his lot with the regionalist painters and all of those other Americans that were really kind of looking away from Europe and concentrating on American art, he has remained in this kind of other territory. So that non-affiliation, I think, has been problematic, and it shouldn't be. I mean, it really shouldn't be.
I would totally agree with that. They don't know what box to place him in.
As if he needs a box.
And, right. You have to be fit in a certain box, and if you don't fit in that box, where do they put you in the galleries? Like, do you go with,
I think actually, Sean, I would say that it's a failure of curators and museum directors in Europe not to have.
It's like a simple-minded idea that someone who painted every day for 50 years needs to be this type of painter, right?
We can't categorize him, therefore we don't show him.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
So a related question, and I'm going to use this as a bridge to the second topic I'd like the panel to discuss, is, we often, when we speak about an artist's work, and I think this is true of Avery, we think about it in monolithic terms. Avery's work has an influence on this artist or that artist, or is being reconsidered, and that's fine up to a point. But as you've gone to great lengths to demonstrate, Avery's work evolved in really significant ways over time, and so that begs the question: are there moments in Avery's career, periods that are of greater interest to contemporary artists, and particularly contemporary artists in Europe today, than others? And I can't help but think of the post-1945, the emergence of color, the work of the 50s, which became increasingly flat and uninflected in terms of drawing, and then that kind of interchange between Avery and the younger generation, where he was responding in terms of brighter color and larger canvases. Whereas for me, as an art historian, I find Avery's work of the 30s and early 40s to be immensely interesting and refreshing and new and bold in that context, and something that deserves to be rediscovered again. But that may not be what people are looking at or thinking about or responding to today.
I think I agree with you. I think that the work from the 1940s has got a universality in its appeal. So he's paring down detail, but he's also taking out elements of observation. He's injecting a kind of very pure emotion into them. When you think of the work of the 30s and the 20s and the 30s in particular, they're fantastic. I love those works. But they are reflective of the society he was living in a way that the later works aren't. When you think about those, the picture, the slide I showed of the city, it's just redolent of that sense of, the depression, the gloom, the poverty, the difficulty, the distortion of city life. And then the works that he did, which were depicting people. Coney Island is it, and some of the beach scenes that he did, where people are kind of packed in there, and it's they're fascinating. It's social commentary in the way that Sickert was, or some of the French Impressionists as well, and I think that they have got maybe slightly less relevance for us today, but are completely fascinating still. And interestingly, in the exhibition we did at the Royal Academy, which literally went from 1918 right up to 65, the feedback I got from artists was so significant. They loved it all. They loved it all. I mean, obviously those late works are kind of, there's something to do with the scale and the abstraction, that they are just pure joy. But they really did engage with every period.
Well, thank you. If I can put a personal pitch in for any part of the exhibition here, I would say take a look at the wonderful watercolors. I think there are at least 3, maybe 4 from that he did in the Gaspé Peninsula on a trip in 1938. They are an astonishment. They're just some of the most amazing things I think he's ever done.
I would totally agree. I think that summer, I mean, I've handled a lot of Averys in the flat files, and I'm constantly thinking that moment he basically mastered that medium. He painted over 150 watercolors in 2 months.
You're kidding.
It's like at least 2 a day, and I think he freed himself, because when I look back and I see a watercolor from his more student-y days, and he's obviously really sort of like grinding it out, like, and then those pieces, it's like he's like, oh, I know where I'm going, like he got looser. He's scratching into them. He's doing
like this.
The technique just blew up, and from there, he's still holding the amazing light in the paper in a great way, which transfers into the canvases later on, and it's to me it's obvious. It's like, oh, those loose sections of those watercolors become these large sections of a huge canvas from the 50s or 60s, but to me that's like a moment. I'm a big paper guy, so that's
well, it's amazing to me that he could do that kind of work on site in the moment, right?
I don't think he's sitting on the rock doing it.
Yeah.
I think he's sketchbook and then back at the shack that they rented on the beach, basically.
Yeah. Still there, they're big watercolors too.
Oh yeah. And I think he really grasped it and like saw what it could really do.
All right, well, check it out. They're really wonderful. So I'd like to get quickly to the second issue, which is a bit more complicated, and that is the question of influence, beginning with what we mean by this term. Now, superficially, we might focus our discussion on resemblance, that is to say, between Avery's work and the work of others. But I think that that will only take us so far, and in any event, Edith has done a really wonderful job of kind of tracing that out in her lecture. So let's take that as a point of departure and really not focus on that, but rather to consider influence in terms of how Avery's example, be this as a draftsman or a colorist, or how he so fluidly distilled what he saw in his own words into shapes, spaces, and colors to form a set of unique relationships independent of any subject matter, end quote, continues to offer new possibilities to artists working today. Now, there are lots of clues as to how to answer this question in the conversations that Edith had with the 7 contemporary artists represented in this exhibition. And these are included in the catalog, and I do encourage you to read them. But there's very little that is definitive in what they have to say on this matter, and they all answered the question very differently. Now, rather than vexing, I found this to be encouraging. a kind of acknowledgement on their part that influence and what an artist such as Henni or Harold Ancart or Andrew Cranston may make of it is a fluid thing and one that is very difficult to pin down. So I hope we can take some time to talk about the concept of influence and what that might mean in the context of this exhibition. Does it reside in the choice of subject matter, in a particular approach to drawing, or the distillation of what has been observed into simplified and more nearly abstract forms that carry within them the essence of things seen? Or might we define influence as a type of validation of the choice of subject, of a certain freedom in the selection and handling of color, or in the distinctive and always varied manner in which Avery drew in his paintings, rendering the details of field and forest, or the contours of hills or the water's edge in willfully odd, because I think they are willfully odd, yet wonderful and always fascinating ways. So I'd like to hear what the panelists, and they bring very different perspectives to this, have to say about this question of influence. And let's start with Henni, because I think it is ultimately a question for the artist to answer, and not anyone else. So if you talk a little bit, if you could, about how you see the idea of influence and how that might have in turn influenced the way you look at Avery's work, and because it obviously it goes beyond resemblance to something else, and I think that something else is going to be different for each and every artist. So why don't we start with you?
I tend to study the paintings when I see them. I don't. How could I put it? I ask myself, why does this work? Because they do. It's not, and in a very unexpected manner. Obviously the colors are very audacious, but not just. And I look at it and I wonder, how is it that he gets all this to work? And because ultimately the question is it a good painting?
No.
It's not. If it's not a good painting, it's not. The rest doesn't matter.
So in some ways it's simply a matter of how did he do that? Why did he make that choice? How did he make that decision?
Yeah. And that's why it's interesting to see the whole career, how all the changes and all the... I think that when we were talking earlier about the truth is, it's very hard to see Avery when you live in Europe. I mean, I've only seen it a few that are at the Whitney, and mostly I went to Strand Bookstore and saw the reproductions, but the later works from the 50s and 60s, I think you really need to see them for real. It's not, the earlier work is easier to appreciate in very good reproductions, and they circulate easier perhaps, but the later work you really need to see them for real to understand. Which is, I'm very, very grateful to Edith and MICAS for inviting me to do this show, so I've really got to see these paintings. They are amazing.
Just as a footnote, the later works are really fascinating, and I think you're right about how difficult they are to understand in reproduction because of their new scale, right?
Yes.
And on that one, again, having a wife who pushes you. Supposedly, my mother says that she was the one who said, the young guys they're scaling up. And they found somebody to stretch canvases for them in Provincetown, and they had to crane them up through a window in the attic or something. But he would have never have stretched a canvas that big just because physically, by that time he wasn't actually that well. Yeah. And he had never painted that scale really
apart
before.
From Chariot Race.
Yeah. That's a panel. It's not a canvas.
Yeah. So let me jump over you to Edith to address this question, if you would, of influence. You began with, obviously with this being one of the key theses of the exhibition, and now you worked your way through the exhibition and it's opening, you've seen it on the walls. How have you come to think about influences, various dimensions?
Influences within the exhibition.
But how Avery has why he continues to influence contemporary art, and what of Avery's work, what dimensions of it really kind of resonate the most? We've heard a little bit about that already. The later work, the scale, the kind of luminosity of color, and the impact of seeing that in person. And there's no substitute for that, obviously.
There's no substitute for that, and I think that, Henni's absolutely right. There is something extraordinary about standing in front of those big canvases and the effect that they have on you. But I think that one of the things that shouldn't be underestimated in an artist like Avery is what's already been discussed, that he changed, he developed throughout his career. He took influences, he gave influences, and he learned from younger artists as he got older, which is kind of that kind of ability to continually change, I think, is really quite extraordinary. And even at the point where he became really successful in the 1940s, that didn't stop him from wanting to continue to change away from the works that were so celebrated into the next phase. So he's always following his own impulse. I think that's something that's very inspiring to artists at the time and now. But also the volume. He has left the most enormous oeuvre of works. There's thousands of paintings.
I don't know, but the works on paper are very vast.
Yeah.
We don't have a catalog resume yet.
But his work ethic.
Oh yeah, he treated it like a factory job.
So he has produced so much work,
Sure.
and I think that becomes really important for engagement. Artists who produce a lot less, they're treated slightly differently in history.
Well, it's an interesting teaser, because what you're saying is there's much more to see that hasn't really been seen yet.
For sure.
And that will add to our understanding, and hopefully also enhance his influence in the world.
I mean, I feel like I learn more about his work all the time, physically handling it. Recently, I just opened a box that just was labeled black and white. It was like an oversized folio. And it was full of 50s era works on rice paper that look like amazing Chinese brush paintings. And they're like so gorgeous, almost monochromatic. And I was like, no one's ever seen these.
Fresh as the day they were made?
They're perfect. Luckily, they never went out. They never were abused by a 1960s framer, So stuff like that, I'm always like, I feel like I gain a little bit more all the time, in the vast collection of works and his ability to change streams,
Wonderful. So let me just end our part of this with the following. I think perhaps in the end, this question of influence simply comes down to an understanding of the freedom and inventiveness that an artist such as Avery brought to his work, and with it, in turn, the permission for artists who appreciate his achievement to strive for the same sense of freedom and inventiveness in their own work, and you have a case study of that in the present exhibition. In this regard, I think the question of influence perhaps has as much to do with admiration as it does with anything else. This is certainly the sense I took from the following observation that Mark Rothko made in his eulogy for his friend and mentor, and it's telling that you ended your lecture with a quote from Rothko, and I'll end this panel discussion with one as well. So there was nothing tentative, Rothko begins, speaking about Avery's work. He always had that naturalness, that exactness, and that inevitable completeness, which can be achieved only by those gifted with magical means, with those born to sing. I think Avery certainly was. Well, thank you. And now we're going to turn the microphone over to you. And if there are any questions, which I hope there will be, of course, from the audience for our panelists, and again, I want to focus on my three colleagues and not on me, that would be great. So the floor is yours.
So,
would you wait for the microphone to get to you? And
show your hand so they know where you are. They'll bring you a microphone.
Thank you.
And please introduce yourself. Tell us the question.
Hi, good morning. My name is Gabriel. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk and a really amazing tour through the past 150 years of art. One of the things that strikes me about what I heard this morning is that one of the great moments of change in Avery's paintings happened in the 40s. Which is a moment that coincided with the Second World War and with sort of the world being churned up. And another thing that was mentioned, and this question is, I guess, for Sean and for Edith. Another thing that was mentioned is that the paintings in the 20s and the 30s also sort of mirror the Great Depression and the kind of social strife that was happening at that moment. And I wondered or whether perhaps you could speak a little bit more generally about the relationship between Avery's paintings and life, the politics and the history and the kind of social stuff that was happening at the time, and whether that coincides or influences or engages at all with the sort of formal innovations that he was experimenting with. Thank you.
I don't think he was a terribly political man at all. I think his responses to the time period come more from, the overall feeling. I mean, New York City in 1929 is not the happiest, well, most of the world, right, is not the happiest place. And those dark cityscapes reveal that. But at the same time, they're always, the family is always trying to get out of the city for the summer times and sort of mine going to Vermont or to the coast or somewhere and trying to mine those places for new material. And it doesn't feel the same. It's not as dark. And I think some of it is just place, We're forgetting that in the 20s and 30s in New York, like London, the atmosphere is full of coal dust and soot, and it's pretty gray. And I think some of the paintings are related to that. Whereas, in the same time period in the 30s, they're in Vermont, and the palette is still dark, but it's not. It still has more color. And I don't know. You don't see a lot of deep, like, real political things. There are moments that we can see. Recently, we figured out an exact date, like down to the day, for a watercolor because everyone's looking at a solar eclipse on the beach with little glasses. And I think he was more drawn to just life than focusing on politics or the war or it was just more like humanity and how people were living. I don't know if that answers it or not.
Can I just add to that? I completely agree with Sean that politics didn't seem to come into his work at all. But the changes in society are reflected in his work. As I said in my lecture, the opening of MoMA, the fact that there was a full-scale Henri Matisse retrospective when Matisse was still alive and engaged in the exhibition that Avery would have seen, the fact that those artists in Europe who were escaping the impending war, like Joseph Albers and Hans Hofmann, who we quoted, they were coming over and having an effect and an impression on the artistic community. And of course, Avery knew people like John Graham, who was the great Russian emigre thinker. He knew Arshile Gorky, he knew Pollock, he knew Thomas Hart Benton, who taught Pollock. So all of those ingredients were there, and perhaps found some expression in his work. So it wasn't politics, but it was the society that he moved in and what he was able to see.
Well, the art world was very, very much smaller and very concentrated, basically in Lower Manhattan. You know, so it's kind of amazing.
That's true, and I think there's an opportunity to sort of rephrase your question and ask how Avery's work at all was sensitive or responsive to the politics of the art world of the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. And the answer was, of course it was. He was wired into that in interesting ways. And one of the most joyful paintings that I've ever seen is the one that Edith, one of the ones that Edith showed in her slide lecture, which is Avery on 57th Street, which is like, I've arrived and I'm wearing outrageous clothes and I've got a big grin on my face, and I've made it in a world that's complicated, and I've made it with galleries that are showing European modernism at the same time, and that tells a whole lot. You could take another painting from a different period and kind of spin the same story from it. That picture of New York in 1928 is absolutely fascinating. And we were talking about this last night. And it's as if every artist who came to New York from the outside felt they had to paint the grim New York City of the 1920s. Glowering skyscrapers or big apartment buildings, the elevated trains and the like. But they realized that, many of them realized, Jose Clemente Orozco, Milton Avery, that wasn't for them. Their path in New York and their path through subject matter in art was going to be very different. And I think he got his bearings very early on in that sense.
He did.
Thank you.
I was going to say that he found the pastoral in New York too.
Yeah.
There's a huge series of riders in Central Park.
They're wonderful.
And the color is a little brighter, and they're a little more joyful. It's not all smokestacks and tugboats.
So there's a lot more to be understood and seen when the rest of the work gets out there, right?
Yeah.
Other questions?
So there's someone at the back. Please introduce yourself and tell us who you're asking the question. And thank you for standing up as well.
Yes, sorry, because I'm here at the back. Thought it was necessary. Hi, my name's Justine. Firstly, thank you for such an interesting lecture. It's so interesting to come up close and personal with Milton Avery, and in such a wonderful way with your experience. I just wanted to ask Sean, you mentioned the black and white discovery that you made recently. I was just curious, being his heir and being responsible for such...
The weight, you mean?
Yes, the weight, exactly. Such responsible for such marvels. How would you go about handling them and perhaps even, sharing them with the public? And what is your intention to do with these discoveries?
Well, we're getting better at it, I'd say. My grandmother was very, you might say, casual with the work. There used to be drawings in a filing cabinet in envelopes, just stacked like this. Now they're all in sleeves in archival boxes, and they're all numbered, and we're trying to be better about it. But part of the problem was that most artists want to make work and not catalog work. So there was never any cataloging done. It was just like stack them somewhere out of the way and try not to spill coffee on them, basically. I get scolded by conservators a fair amount, but I still learn. We're getting better at it. We have more help now. And the database, modern technology helps too. So we're trying to be good, basically.
That's very interesting to hear. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for your question as well. Do we have anyone else, please? We've had the first two, so the ice has been broken. You shouldn't be shy now. Can I see? There we go. We'll bring you a microphone. Perfect.
Hi, thank you once again for this wonderful event and very informative, to be honest. So my question is like in the imaginary dimension. So I think Milton Avery didn't know anything about Malta. Probably not that the country. There is a place in the world called Malta. So my question is, if he was alive and he would have seen the paintings coming over across the Atlantic to this country, what would have been his reaction?
Well, that's a good question. He got fairly close. He was in the south of France once in the early 1950s. I mean, obviously, Malta provides an amazing vista to the Mediterranean from all angles. And he was drawn to the horizon and the sea from very early on. I think that would have been amazing. Also, the very early temples and things I could see, rock formations, and the interest in that, probably more than the cathedrals and the architecture. But yeah, he was able to mine almost any place for new work, I think. He never lacking for never waiting a long time for the muse to sit on his shoulder, you know. I think Malta would have done he would have done well with Malta.
Yeah, Sean, I think the answer wants to be that he would be delighted and enchanted with Malta and want to apply for honorary citizenship right away.
Definitely now. Yeah.
All right. Well, can we call it a day?
Yeah, we have time for just one last one, probably from my calculations. So you're the last one officially today. We'll bring you a microphone. And then maybe we can get a closing remarks from each of you to officially close off after answering this question.
Hi, a quick one. My name's Anna. I wanted to ask a bit more about the relationship between Sally and Milton. And in the talk, Edith mentioned that they used to go drawing together and they had quite a close relationship, and her work is quite celebrated as well. I was speaking to Wakas about that. I wanted to know a bit more about their routines and their kind of lives as artists together and that kind of relationship, because that's hugely important, and especially that you mentioned that his work is celebrated because of her efforts too. So, thank you.
Well, I think she's beginning to get her due now, as everyone's searching for a underappreciated female painter. She is one. You know, my mother always said that she had sort of a great belief from very early on in Milton's abilities, and obviously they fell quickly in love and got married, had a child. They worked side by side for many decades. Her day job was she was illustrating for the New York Times and then also for advertising. And so this was all happening in the living room of the apartment. It wasn't like he went off to his beautiful studio somewhere. They were just there, you know, easel and drafting table. And but she, at the same time, she did put her sort of pure artistic career on hold, which after his death, she really spent more time doing. She was balancing, sort of managing the estate of his work, but her creative output really skyrocketed after his death. And also she was, 18 years younger than he was. And so when he passed away, she wasn't that old. and she had a lot of energy, and she was a very energetic person and lived to be over 100 years old. And so she created a lot after, she had like a whole nother life after he passed away. But I don't think, I never sensed that she had any bitterness or anything about her choice, because it really was hers. And they did, you know, everyone always thinks that the transfer of ideas went from one easel to the other, right? Like it was always Milton's idea went to, you know, Sally was mine. And when I see the paintings that were created at the same time, I'm like, he took that from her. You know, I think it was pretty even, actually, you know.
Thank you very much. That's interesting to hear. I don't know if any of you want to give us one last closing remark to officially close off today's event. I know you've probably said what you had to say, but giving you the last chance, any of you.
I just want to say, just reiterate something that Timothy kindly said, is there is a beautiful catalogue, fully illustrated, and one of the most lovely things are the statements from the artists in the back. So I urge you all to get a copy and to read that, because it really does explain how individual those relationships and unique those relationships with each of the contemporary artists has with Avery's work.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to say I'm so pleased with how the show looks, really. I mean, from being on this side of it and knowing how much work went into it, these shows take years and a lot of moving parts, and a lot of people have to be very deep set in their belief that it can happen and that it's worthwhile. And the creation of this new space, it all seems kind of like a miracle. That at the end of the day, you're like, I can't believe it actually all happened. And I'm just so pleased with the way it looks, and that this, you know, this whole new world gets to experience the work and experience it in relation to contemporary painters and see new angles, and I'm just really, really pleased. Thank you.
I want to thank Edith for the invitation and everyone at MICAS. I'm overwhelming seeing my work hanging next to Milton Avery's. It's really something. Thank you.
Thank you. And Timothy, the final word today is yours.
The last word. Well, I think the last word should start with thanks to the artists who participated in the exhibition. It's a brave thing to do, to put your work out there in a new and different context, but it's also refreshing to escape the kind of monographic straitjacket, the presentation of an artist's work alone, which has its value, but it's also valuable, and always instructive to see an artist's work in a different context, in conversation with different work, particularly work that spans several generations. And so I found that to be one of the most refreshing and again, bravest parts of the exhibition. So I thank you and your colleagues for that. And of course, I want to thank all of you for giving over a precious Saturday morning when the weather is beautiful outside. Sit in, yes, a beautiful room, but in a room listening to people talk for 2 hours. That's brave as well, and I thank you for that. Thanks.
Thank you, Timothy. And since the weather is nice and we've had the time here, let's go off and enjoy the weather. Have a nice day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you once again.